Hey guys, and welcome back. Now, before we proceed any further, one thing I want to do is to give a brief mention on the concept of Linux distros. Now, perhaps you may have heard this term before, Linux distros, or maybe Linux distribution, both of which refer to the same thing. A distro means distribution. So the question is, what exactly is a Linux distro? Well, here is the deal with Linux. Linux is very flexible, and it is what is called open source software. This pretty much means that the code is readily available for people to inspect and to modify and to create variations of. It's basically the opposite of proprietary software. So ultimately, when you have this type of freely available open source software, invariably people like to make their own modifications, and that is effectively what we're talking about when we have different Linux distributions. So at a high level, just assume, or rather interpret, that a Linux distribution just means a different type of Linux, a different flavour of Linux. So just searching right here, Linux distros, straight away Google is beginning to show me a whole bunch of popular Linux distros. So we have one called Ubuntu. This is probably my personal favourite. We have a completely different flavour called Fedora, and we have all of these different types. So some might be used for general administration, whereas some might be used as a type of replacement day-to-day operating system. You know, the way you use your Windows machine to just browse YouTube and go on Netflix? There even are Linux distributions optimized for that type of experience. Whereas you may have something like, say, Kali Linux, which is a very famous Linux distribution in the security world, because this distribution is tailored towards hacking and digital forensics. To understand what we're saying here, we can have different versions of Linux. Some might be towards security testing, some might be geared towards just a general browsing experience for the average user that doesn't have all the complexities of all these hacking tools. So now that we actually understand that Linux comes in different distributions, different flavors, we have to decide what distribution should we actually install, because we do have an absolute kaleidoscope of options available to us. But as we know, we are actually studying for the LPIC 1 examination. Now, as it transpires, the recommended distribution that I would suggest that we get is a Debian based distribution. This is what we can use for the bulk of our day-to-day practice. Now, not to get into the deep details of different distributions all at once right now, but as a derivative of Debian, we have the very popular Ubuntu. So what I'm suggesting is that we actually install an Ubuntu based distribution. But here is the thing, like we know, Linux has many variations, and in fact, we have variations on Ubuntu itself. So I would recommend that we installing Ubuntu, which is an enterprise open source Linux system. But here is the thing, Ubuntu out of the box actually comes with more things than we actually even need. So, in order to make this course as accessible as possible and to reduce the demands on the computer running the operating system, I'm going to suggest that we actually install a lighter weight version of Ubuntu. So we have the option to download one called Xubuntu. This is going to require less resources from your computer, and it's going to give us everything we need from our Ubuntu system. Similarly, if you would prefer, there is an even lighter weight version of this called Lubuntu, for lightweight Ubuntu. And if you really do have limited resources on which to run your computer, you don't have much RAM, you don't have much CPU, then perhaps Lubuntu would be a good choice for you. But generally speaking, I think Xubuntu is the one we're going to go for. This to me is a very good compromise. Now, we haven't actually solved the problem completely. Now, there is a whole other style of Linux, and that is based off of Red Hat Linux. Now, as it transpires for the LPIC 1 examination, there are some things that we have to do and have to understand that relates particularly to Red Hat Linux distributions. So what I'm suggesting is that we actually have two different Linux distributions available to us. One I'm suggesting we have is a Debian based solution, and the one I'm going to install is Xubuntu. That's going to be our main driver. But when it comes to testing out different package managers, and we'll get to see what those are a little bit later on within this course, we also want to choose a Red Hat based distribution. So if we just go and search for something like Red Hat Linux distribution list, if we click on this link here for example, we can see all of these distributions which are based off of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Now the latest one on the block is one called Rocky Linux. And like I say, this is a free and open source operating system. So this is the one that I'm going to choose in addition to my Ubuntu machine. But again, if you scroll on down, you could perhaps choose things like Alma Linux, or CentOS, or Fedora, so on and so forth. So ultimately, really you can pick your own poison, but we do want to have a general distribution such as Ubuntu, and we do want to have a Red Hat based distribution. Now you might be wondering, well, how on earth are we going to have two different operating systems to test out? Are we going to have to completely uninstall one and then replace it with the other and switch back and forth? Well, absolutely not. The good news is that we're going to be able to leverage the world and the power of virtualization. This is going to give us a nice, safe environment where we can have multiple different operating systems, such as Ubuntu, as well as Rocky Linux, and we can quite easily toggle between the two as needed. And the good news is that the virtual environment is very, very safe. Whatever we do within the virtual environment should not actually affect the operations within your host machine, be it a Windows computer or a Mac computer, or whatever you happen to be running. So now we have an understanding of what distributions are, we have an understanding of what types of distributions are needed for the LPIC examination. We've talked about the solution to use virtualization, so how about we get our hands dirty and begin creating these virtual operating systems? And how are we going to do that? Well, the good news is that that's what we're going to be doing in the very next nugget. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.